My own father testified against me, not in some family feud, in a federal tribunal, in uniform. He sat there, chest puffed with medals, and told a panel of four-star officers that his daughter, me, was a disgrace to the military. He called me a glorified typist, said I had no grit, no honor, that I didn't deserve the uniform I'd worn for 10 years. But what he didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that I'd spent half my career working in places that didn't officially exist. And the man presiding over my trial, he once signed the orders that turned me into a ghost. So when I stood and invoked a protocol no one had dared mention in decades, the courtroom fell silent, and the general stood up. Not my father, the other one. The first thing I remember is the hum. That quiet, low-frequency buzz in the courtroom, the air conditioner working overtime against the heat of rank and judgment. Everything else was silent, not solemn, not respectful. Silent in that way a trap is quiet before it snaps shut. Then came the scrape of a chair. Everyone turned, not toward me, the accused, but toward the man sitting in the gallery. My father, General Frank Greaves, decorated war hero, veteran of 2 decades worth of operations he never fully came home from. And, most importantly to him, father of 2, Eli, the Marine, and me, Lila, the cyber captain. Or, as he once called me over Thanksgiving dinner, Lieutenant Upload. He had just finished testifying against me. He was brought in as a character witness, for his own daughter, and instead used the entire 5 minutes to perform a eulogy. Not for me, but for the idea of what he thought a real soldier used to be. "The problem here, Admiral," he said, straightening his chest full of ribbons like a proud peacock, "isn't what she did, it's what she represents. A generation of officers with no grit, no backbone. She's not a warrior, she's a keyboard with clearance." I stood at attention. I didn't move, I didn't blink, but I felt the burn of it settle deep in my stomach. The same burn I felt as a kid when I'd bring home a perfect score on a test and be told, "Well, let's see how you do when it actually counts." I'd spent a decade in service, built strategies that saved lives, coordinated assets that no one even knows existed. But all he saw was a woman in uniform without a rifle. The man who was supposed to vouch for me in my darkest hour signed the paperwork to bury me instead. Behind the bench, Admiral Juno Carter sat stone-faced, the head of naval intelligence with eyes like sharpened glass. He was watching me closely, not with judgment, not yet, but with calculation. The charges were serious: insubordination, breach of protocol, potential compromise of national security. My entire career dangled on the thread of perception. But the truth? The truth was that I had followed orders. Orders written in a font most people never get to read. My so-called mistake was a cover action, one that saved hundreds, maybe thousands. But it couldn't be explained, not easily, not legally, not without invoking a ghost. So I stood there, my spine stiff, my breath shallow, and I waited. Waited as my father's words echoed around the chamber like shrapnel. I heard the snickers of other officers, old school, boots-on-the-ground types, who had never trusted the rise of Cyber Command. And yet, one person didn't laugh. Admiral Carter leaned in. His brow furrowed. Something in my stillness, something in the way I didn't defend myself, caught his attention. And when he finally spoke, it wasn't to my father. "Commander Greaves," he said slowly, "do you have a response to the witness's testimony, or the charges laid before you?" My fingers didn't tremble, my voice didn't crack. Instead, I said 7 words that cracked open the floor beneath us all. "I invoke continuity of command, Protocol 11 Zulu." The room didn't gasp, it choked. A cold ripple ran through the tribunal. My lawyer nearly dropped his pen. My father blinked, confused. But Admiral Carter? He stiffened like he'd seen a ghost. Because he had. My mother always made meatloaf on Sundays. Not the frozen kind. The real deal. Hand-mixed, wrapped in bacon, slow-baked with ketchup and brown sugar. It smelled like comfort and childhood and everything I used to think home was supposed to mean. That night, the table was set for 6. Eli had just flown back from Okinawa, fresh from a promotion to first sergeant. My dad was glowing, beaming with the pride of a father whose legacy had just secured its next chapter. The real soldier, as he always said. I sat at the end of the table, not dressed in uniform, but neat, like always, polished, composed, out of habit, not for them. Eli told some story about chasing down a rogue drone during a desert training op, and everyone laughed, especially Dad. He slapped the table, reached for his glass of whiskey, and raised it high. "To Eli," he said, "a true leader of men, a combat warrior, a Greaves through and through." I lifted my glass quietly, said nothing. It wasn't the first time I'd been invisible at this table. Later, after the plates were cleared and my dad had gone into one of his long monologues about what war used to be, I finally spoke up. I was awarded the Defense Superior Service Medal last month. I tried to make it sound casual, like I wasn't hoping, even now, for a nod, a pause, maybe a second of pride. My dad looked up, smiled politely, reached across the table to pat my hand like I was 5. "That's nice, honey, very nice," he said. Then with that infuriating half smirk, "Did you coordinate the ceremony or just the invites?" He meant it as a joke, but it landed like a bullet. My mother winced. Eli chuckled, and I sat there trying to swallow a lump the size of a landmine. He turned back to Eli and started talking about war paint or something. I don't even remember. I was already gone. Gone into my head, flipping through the mental ledger I kept. Every dismissal, every slight, every time my father reduced 10 years of classified service to email duty. That medal? It wasn't for attendance. It was for coordinating cyber intel that prevented a live chemical attack in Central Europe. 46 soldiers were breathing because of what I did. But sure, let's call it party planning. That was the moment he gave me the nickname that would stick for years. Lieutenant Upload. Every time I heard it, I tasted rust. Later that night, I found my mom in the kitchen, humming softly as she dried the china. I leaned against the counter, still holding a half-empty glass of water like it could anchor me. She looked up. "He didn't mean anything by it," she said. I didn't reply. She kept going. "Your dad, he comes from a time where you earned respect with bruises, not bandwidth." That was her version of support, a defense for why I should keep shrinking to keep the peace. She meant well, but all I heard was this. "It's not that you're not enough, it's that you're not his kind of enough." And that stung worse than the joke, because it told me everything I needed to know. In this house, success was only visible if it bled or bruised. It didn't have a name. No label on the door, no line item on a budget. Just a 6-digit code that changed every 48 hours and a fingerprint scan that only matched a handful of people on the planet. We called it the room, but even that was a kindness. It sat 2 floors below a consulate in Vilnius, or at least that's what the building claimed to be. Above ground, it was all suits and flags. Below, cold metal, soundproof walls, no windows, no clocks, just time, stretching like static. That's where I worked, where the real me lived. The same week my father toasted Eli over pot roast and Pinot Noir, I was 5,000 miles away, sitting under fluorescent light, staring at a man who had planned to murder 800 civilians using a waterborne nerve agent. My name in that room wasn't Lila Greaves. I was Ghostlight 7. The man across from me was smart, arrogant, trained to resist pain, humiliation, fatigue, a product of silence and ideology. He sized me up when I walked in. A woman, American, no uniform, just a clipboard and a calm expression. To him, I was soft, a civilian with clearance. But I wasn't there to scream or slap or drag information out of him. That never worked. Not with the real ones. I was there to talk. We started with nothing, just his name, denied it. Of course, denied everything, smirked, called me pretty, asked if I knew how to make tea. I let him talk. Then I asked him about Gorky Street. He paused, just a flicker, not fear, not yet, but curiosity. I asked if the baker on the corner still made black rye in the mornings, told him how the steam from the church windows froze in January, described the exact sound the trams made turning near the market. He blinked. How would I know that? I asked if his mother still sang to him on Sundays. The one about the Iron River. I said it in Russian, not just fluent but regional, with the soft consonants of a dialect he hadn't heard since he was 6. That's when the crack formed. Not in his face, in his breath. He sat still, but his rhythm changed. He leaned back slowly and asked, "Who are you?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The next 5 hours weren't interrogation. They were dissection. I peeled away the identity he'd built for himself, piece by piece. Not with threats, but with familiarity, empathy, precision. When the first tear came, he wiped it away like it was nothing. But the second, he let it fall. He gave us everything, the drop site, the delivery mechanism, the signal timing. Then he slumped in the chair, exhausted. In my earpiece, a voice buzzed to life. "Solid intel confirmed, green light widow's whisper, good work Ghostlight, exfil in 5. I stood, gathered the folder, and walked out without a word. Outside the room, I peeled off the gloves, shoved the data drive into a courier case. By the time I reached the surface, the sun had risen, pale and silent over a city that didn't know how close it had come to screaming. Back home, they were carving turkey. My mother was probably folding napkins into swans. Eli was telling another story about real war. My father was pouring another drink and saying something like, "Lila's just doing computer stuff, whatever that means." Meanwhile, I was the reason 2 countries didn't bury their children that week. But no one back home would ever know, because the room didn't exist. And neither did I. The prep room was colder than the courtroom. It wasn't the temperature, it was the air itself, thick, still, like the walls were holding their breath. Lieutenant Jason Miller paced back and forth, trying not to look like a 26-year-old JAG attorney who had just been handed the most impossible case of his life. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded on the table, eyes forward. He was speaking, but I barely heard him. We can argue mitigating circumstances, emotional duress. You weren't briefed properly. We plead for leniency and let them think you made a mistake. That's the safest path forward. He meant well, he really did. The kids still believed the system was designed for justice. But I wasn't fighting a system. I was correcting it. Lieutenant, I said softly. He froze mid-sentence. We're not going to argue the charge. He blinked. I don't understand. We're not here to defend, I continued. We're here to nullify. He stared at me like I'd grown horns. Nullify? With what, Commander? You want to argue the entire operation was a setup? That it was a misdirection from inside your own division? I didn't answer, not yet. Instead, I leaned forward and said 6 words I'd waited years to say. I'm invoking Protocol 11 Zulu. He dropped his binder. No, absolutely not. That's Ghost Protocol. That's career suicide. I tilted my head. Only if I'm wrong. He ran a hand through his hair, already coming loose from stress. If the panel doesn't believe you, if Admiral Carter doesn't have the clearance you think he does, they won't just dismiss the claim. They'll bury you. You'll be court-martialed for falsifying an official statement. But I wasn't guessing. I had done the work. I knew exactly who Juno Carter was. I knew what operations he had signed off on in 21. I knew which secure channels had been flagged for his clearance level. And I knew, beyond any doubt, he was one of the last people on Earth who would recognize my real name. Ghostlight 7. My father's voice still rang in my head. She's not a soldier, she's a screensaver. He had no idea what room he'd walked into, or what trap he'd willingly stepped on. Because the moment he testified, the moment he turned the tribunal into a stage, I knew the only way to take back the narrative was to weaponize the very thing he mocked, protocol. Are you really going to do this? Miller asked, eyes wide. I stood, straightening my jacket. My father already tried to bury me today, I said. He just didn't realize I brought the shovel. When I walked back into that tribunal room, it was like stepping onto a chessboard where every move had already been calculated. Admiral Carter watched me closely. My father sat in the gallery, arms crossed, smug as ever, the kind of smug that comes from a man who believes the story has ended, and he's the author. He had no idea he was a footnote. Carter's voice cut through the stillness. Commander Greaves, do you have a response to the witness testimony, or the charges before you? I didn't flinch, didn't pause. I invoke continuity of command, I said. Protocol 11 Zulu. A ripple. It was quiet, not loud, not dramatic, but in that silence, a new kind of energy took over the room. The kind that only comes when secrets start breathing. One Air Force general leaned forward. Another officer whispered to a colleague. Miller looked like he was trying not to faint, but the man I watched most closely was Admiral Carter. He didn't look confused. He looked alert. Commander, he said, voice low, you understand the consequences if you're invoking this under false pretenses? I do, sir. And on what grounds do you make the claim? I met his eyes. My actions and the incident in question were conducted under Operational Directive Ghostlight 7. Silence. A beat. 2 beats. Then Carter's jaw locked. And that's when I knew. He remembered. Clear the chamber. Admiral Carter's voice was calm, but it carried the weight of thunder. All non-essential personnel will vacate immediately. This tribunal is now sealed. Chairs scraped, boots shuffled. The gallery emptied in silence, like the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. Everyone left, except 4 people, Carter, 2 remaining panel members, my lawyer, still pale as a sheet, and my father. He stayed seated, arms folded, confused, not concerned. To him, it was bureaucratic theater. To me, it was ignition. Admiral Carter leaned in, his steel gaze fixed on mine. Show me your authorization, Commander. I nodded once. No drama, no speech, just truth. I reached up and unfastened the top buttons of my uniform collar. The room watched in silence as I peeled the fabric aside, exposing a narrow patch of skin high on my ribcage, pale, precise, unmarred, except for one thing. A scar. No, not a scar, a mark. 3 interlocking geometric lines laser-etched into my skin, invisible under normal light, blindingly clear under ultraviolet. The kind of mark given to operatives sent where governments officially don't go. A sigil for missions where names don't exist, and return isn't guaranteed. Admiral Carter's face changed instantly. He stood up so fast his chair slammed against the wall. His lips parted. Dear God. He turned, wide-eyed, to the other officers. Do you know what this is? He demanded, pointing at the mark. That is a night glass identifier. My father finally spoke. What the hell is night glass? Carter turned to him, slowly, like he couldn't believe the man had the audacity to speak. General Greaves, he said, his voice razor thin. "You testified that your daughter was a disgrace to the uniform, that she spent her career pushing buttons." He walked toward him, every step deliberate. "You called her a keyboard warrior, a waste of a name." Carter turned back to me, his face solemn. "Commander Greaves," he said clearly, "is one of only 3 living Nightglass operatives cleared for zero visibility assignments under Directive Ghostlight." He looked back at my father. "She's the reason the 2022 Denver biocrypt attack was dismantled before it reached its second stage. You don't even know what that means because you were never cleared to." My father sat there, frozen. Carter kept going, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "You spent your life chasing a shadow of glory. Meanwhile, your daughter lived in it. She's not a tech clerk. She is the top field strategist for cyber-psychological operations on this coast. In a room full of stars, she's the one holding the map." He turned back to the tribunal panel. "I move to expunge all charges with extreme prejudice. This entire tribunal was built on misclassification. It ends now." He banged the gavel. Motion carried. Just like that, it was over. My father didn't move. He just sat there, hands limp, staring at nothing. When the medics entered, he flinched. My mother, who had been waiting outside, rushed in. Her face was ashen, mascara trailing like war paint. She touched his shoulder. He didn't look at her. Didn't look at anyone. Except me. He finally turned. And for the first time in my life, I saw it. Not pride, not anger, recognition. The realization that the thing he spent his life trying to be was sitting right in front of him, wearing his last name. And she was nothing like him. I didn't smile, didn't blink. I simply stood. He watched me walk out of that courtroom, not as a daughter, not as a disappointment, but as a ghost that finally stepped into the light. 6 months later, the courtroom felt like another life. The kind you remember in flashes, sterile lighting, polished boots, and the echo of a gavel that reset the trajectory of everything. Now, my office overlooks a sliver of Virginia woods just beyond Langley, quiet, peaceful, secure. On the door, Commander Lila Greaves, Unit Chief, Strategic Cyber Operations. The title meant less to me than the silence that came with it. No judgment, no doubt, no applause. Just purpose. My team doesn't toast promotions. They don't ask about medals or photo ops. They speak the language I've lived in for a decade, full of acronyms and dead drop reports, firewall stress tests, and encryption layers. They operate in precision, not permission. And they trust me. That trust? It's what kept me breathing long enough to make it here. This morning, I was reviewing intel on an emerging signal distortion anomaly in the Balkan region, a small red dot blinking against a grid, when something strange popped up in the corner of my screen. New message, external server, sender, Jenner Frank Greaves, Retiet SafeMail, Gov. Subject line Lila. I stared at it for a while. Not frozen, just still. Like I was holding a letter that had traveled across time, stitched together with things he'd never said when it mattered. I didn't want to open it. Not out of anger. Out of clarity. There was a version of me, the younger one, the one who used to pray that he'd see her, who would have begged for this moment, who would have read that subject line over and over, hoping the words would say, "I'm proud of you. I was wrong. You mattered, even if I didn't say it." But that version of me doesn't sit behind this desk anymore. I clicked it open, not to read, just to scan, just enough. The first line read, "I was wrong about everything. I am so..." I stopped reading. I hovered over the delete key, then moved it carefully into archive. Let it sit there, unread, untouched, not out of spite, but because I didn't need it. I found something better. I found peace. Not the peace that comes from apologies, the peace that comes from knowing, with absolute certainty, that his permission was never a requirement for my worth. He measured strength by parade formations. I learned it's measured by what you protect when no one's clapping. He raised a soldier who followed orders. The world raised a woman who rewrote the rules. I shut my laptop and looked out the window. Downstairs, my team was assembling for an early briefing. Young analysts, hardened field agents, some of them barely old enough to rent a car, but already fluent in a language few outsiders ever get to hear. They look at me differently than my father ever did. They don't see a daughter, or a disappointment, or a woman in a uniform who forgot to bleed. They see a leader, and that's enough. I picked up my badge, clipped it to my blazer, and headed down to the briefing room. The day was waiting, and this time, this life, was mine. Sometimes the loudest battles are fought in silence. Sometimes the scars you carry aren't meant to be seen. They're meant to be understood by those who know what real sacrifice looks like. I spent years trying to earn the approval of someone who never saw me. But I learned this. You don't need validation from those who refuse to understand your strength. Your worth isn't written in applause. It's written in the lives you protect, the truths you carry, and the courage it takes to stand alone when the world expects you to disappear. If you've ever had to fight for your voice in a room that tried to erase you, you're not alone. Here at Sweet Revenge, Happy Ending, we share stories like yours. Stories of quiet strength, overdue reckoning, and the kind of justice that heals from the inside out. Subscribe if this story resonated. And remember, revenge doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply walks out of the room, with its head held high.